If you have your Bibles this morning, join me in turning in the New Testament, the second half of the Bible, to the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 5. 2 Corinthians, chapter 5. This being Thanksgiving week, we are going to actually start out this morning with a short Thanksgiving quiz. You don't get graded for this, and it's you don't have to share your answers with anybody else, but just to see what you know and what you don't know about Thanksgiving. The story of the first Thanksgiving in Plymouth is really a fascinating story of the providence and grace of God, of how God led the pilgrims through unforeseen circumstances to land at just the right place he wanted them to be. They set out for Virginia. They ended up in Massachusetts, quite a distance away. They landed at the one place that was not infested with ferocious Indians. And God led them just the right resources to carry them through. Fascinating story. There are a number of great resources to learn about that. One I recommend is a book called The Light and the Glory by David Manuel and Peter Marshall. A fantastic book that goes into depth about that story. But first question, what year did the Pilgrims celebrate the first Thanksgiving in Plymouth? Was it 1492, 1620, 1621, 1776? The answer, of course, is 1621. Say, wait, they came over in 1620, didn't they? Yes, they did, but the first Thanksgiving was the next year after God brought them through the winter. God provided a great harvest for them. The Pilgrims, we know, came over on the Mayflower, but when they actually started out, they came over on two boats. What was the second ship that started out with them? Was it the Speedwell, the Mayflower II, the Queen Mary, or the Queen Elizabeth? The answer is the Speedwell. The Plymouth Pilgrims had started out in Scrooby, England on two boats. The Speedwell sprung a leak, and so that both ships had to go back to port, and everybody on the Speedwell crowded into the Mayflower. And the Mayflower II is currently docked up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. You can go through a replica of the original Mayflower and get an idea of the conditions. But probably the area about this half of the sanctuary, all the pilgrims crowded in for that trip. So you had 102 passengers all crowded into a space this far, which leads then to the question, how long was the voyage from England to the New World? Was it 66 days, 106 days, or 146 days? The answer is 66 days. So for 66 days, 102 pilgrims spend their days and nights in a space this big. Terrible conditions crossing the ocean. Of the original 102 pilgrims that came, approximately how many survived to celebrate the first Thanksgiving? Was it 101, 50, or 10? The answer is 50. So that means that over half of them died in the first year. The first winter was very harsh. The Indians who were invited to the Thanksgiving feast were of the Wampanoag tribe. So who was their chief? Was it Massasoit, Pemaquid, Samoset, or Squanto? The answer is Massasoit. Hopefully you remembered that. Samoset is the first Indian they meet, who comes out the first day, he goes back, he comes back the next day with Squanto. And the story of Squanto is a fascinating story of God's provision. This Indian had been kidnapped away from his people. He had been taken off to Spain as a captive, where a Jesuit priest taught him to speak English. He was set free, returned back over to the colonies. His tribe had all died from a disease, and so he went to be with the nearby Wampanoag people. And so Squanto was such an invaluable resource to the Pilgrims. How fast can a wild turkey fly? Just for fun, is it 20 miles an hour, 27 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour, or 55 miles an hour? The answer is 55 miles per hour. Short distances, not for a long haul, but a wild turkey can fly 55 miles per hour. Very fast. Then the next one, name 3 pilgrims. Is it Enoch, Noah, and Abraham? Ringo Starr, John Lennon, Paul McCartney? Miles Standish, John Winthrop, William Bradford? Or Priscilla Alden, John Alden, and Cotton Mather? And the answer, which you may not be expecting, is Enoch, Noah, and Abraham. Say, what in the world are you talking about? When we hear the word pilgrim, we normally think of the colonists who landed in Plymouth in 1620. However, a pilgrim is really a word for someone traveling on a long journey. And of course, we know Ringo Starr, John Lennon, Beatles. John Winthrop was actually a part of another group in New England, not the Pilgrims, but the Puritans. Same thing, Cotton Mather, Puritans. But this idea of pilgrims, you say, well, really, we're all pilgrims. We are all traveling on a journey. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, the chapter of the great heroes of the faith, we're told about Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham, and then it goes on in verse 13 of that chapter to say, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. So the answer to the quiz, Enoch, Noah, and Abraham are all pilgrims. That's what God says in Hebrews. If you have the NIV version, New International Version, instead of pilgrims, you find the word aliens there, which in our culture today has a very different idea. But the idea of an alien is somebody who's out of their country traveling. The New Living Translation uses the term nomads, which is a lot closer to that pilgrim idea. So as we come to celebrate Thanksgiving this week, we do it realizing that we are pilgrims, we are nomads, we are travelers, because we're not home yet. In the words of the song that many of us know, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. Goes on, the angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't be at home in this world anymore. So that is the idea that we find here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that we're going to look at today. We have been looking here in this book written by the Apostle Paul to Christians who are in the city of Corinth, a key seaport city between northern Greece and southern Greece. Paul is writing this letter to encourage them, to comfort them, to reaffirm his love for them. And he writes to encourage us to think rightly about how we live. We've already talked about being like Jesus in different ways. Corinthians talks about smelling like Jesus. Say, what in the world? If you missed it, watch the sermon online. We're to smell like Jesus. We are to look like Jesus. We're to sound like Jesus. We're to struggle like Jesus. Today we want to look in chapter 5 at the idea that we are to be dressed like Jesus.